Hello and welcome to an all-new episode of the Transfix Take podcast, where we are performance-driven. It's the week of November 1st, and we are bringing you news, insights, and trends for shippers and carriers from our market expert, Justin Mays. And Mays, it is always great to be with you.
Hey Jenny, it's great to be back with you as well this week to close out the month of October and start shifting gears for November.
Now, of course, we're inching closer to the holiday season, specifically Thanksgiving, which we have noted as where we might possibly see volatility. What are you thinking, Mays?
That's right, Jenny. Usually, as we approach and go past the end of the month, we traditionally would see markets tighten up a little bit with some pressure on spot and a slight increase in rates. But over the past week, this has not been the story.
At this point, I'd be curious to know how high rates will go given how low they are right now.
Exactly, Jenny. Last week, we saw an even greater decline than I would have anticipated and even gambled on. Volatility just isn't there in the sense of rates increasing. But I have to start shifting my mindset when talking about volatility, because we may not be seeing volatility in the sense of what we witnessed over the pandemic with rates significantly increasing or decreasing at different times. But at this point, we are still seeing volatility in the way that carriers operate.
And it's no surprise, because at this point what we're watching is carriers trying to win up against a very soft market.
Well, Jenny, I'm shocked to see rates have fallen back to levels not seen since May, where I thought they would never truly go to again. And this is in Q4. Carriers are definitely facing some volatility operating their business and their cash flows. Most were likely hoping for some type of stronger market in Q4 to help them out, even if it was just a slim increase. But instead, Jenny, we are seeing line haul rates go to the lowest point, like I called out, since the bottoming of the market in the first half of May, while at the same time seeing fuel continue to be at a higher cost. And Jenny, at the end of the day, right now, line hauls have fallen quite a bit, and the burden of fuel is still on the carrier's hands. And to be honest, most may not be seeing this drop in rates because they're looking at all-in rates. But at the end of the day, line hauls are being pushed down farther than most would have anticipated in Q4.
So Mays, I almost hate to ask this, but I think it's necessary. Are you anticipating that we're not going to see a very advantageous holiday as we normally would, especially for carriers? What are you thinking here?
Well, Jenny, going into the holidays, I just don't see any volatility impacting rates to drive them more favorable for carriers. At the end of the day, I don't believe that many drivers will come off the road. Assets, well, they may have some drivers park their trucks, but at the end of the day, anyone will accept every load coming their way right now. They aren't in the best position either, especially if they're operating with leased-on drivers. So again, I don't think we're going to see really any holiday disruptions this year compared to what we've seen over the past few years. And drivers and carriers should not look forward to much of a shift in rates due to the holidays.
But you know what, Mays? I was afraid that you were going to say that, and I can assume the same can be said for small carriers who really are not able to afford taking their drivers off the road during the holiday season. It is truly a fight to stay on the road for the highest rate possible. And that said, if no one's going off the road, then that just means that we continue to have a surplus of capacity, right?
That's right, Jenny. There continues to be too much supply out there for the current demand. And when you look at 10 rejections, you see this in plain sight. Rejections also fell last week and are hovering right around 3.5%. So most carriers and brokers are accepting every contract load that comes their way, which in result is really driving the continued decrease in the spot market and the drying up of available freight.
All right, my friend, well, why don't we get into specifics? What are you currently seeing when it comes to where the national average rate per mile is sitting?
Walking into this week, we're at $1.53. Now, if I was a betting man, I would say that we're not going to see them cross the $1.49 line, but I also didn't think they'd come back down this low. Now, I do think in the back half of November, we'll see some pressure put on spot rates, but not nearly enough to truly make a difference for carriers out there.
I'm still holding on to optimism, but that said, I know that this episode is not going to be all about the gloom. Mays, do the honors.
There is some good news out there, and that is that the UAW auto workers strike has reached a tentative agreement as of this morning with all big three manufacturers.
That's right, and GE has also worked their way into the agreement as well.
And this could, in return, hopefully push some more volume in the truckload market. though, again, nothing too noticeable. On the flip side, rails have started taking back more volume from the truckload side. And this is something to keep an eye on. As I mentioned before, there's not a lot of freight that needs to be expedited, so you're seeing shippers opt to move longer lengths of haul on the rail to save money as rail costs continue to decline.
You know, Maze, I think at some point we're going to have to really do a deep dive on a consumer behavior trends episode, just because I can't tell if consumers are truly not consuming as much as they have. You know, you look at Amazon Prime Day results from the one that just happened about a month ago, and it was the most successful Prime Day that they've had since its inception. Or perhaps it's that consumers are really purchasing much sooner in anticipation of a holiday season so that they can avoid any potential supply chain shortages or backups like we did a year or two ago. That said, you know what it's time for, the regional breakdown, Maze. I do want to note we're sitting currently at 3.5% in the tender rejection rate, which is a little bit lower than what we saw last week. So interestingly enough, it just tells the full story of what you've been telling us before. But that said, let's get started in the Midwest. What's happening there?
The Midwest, again, is a mix of two tales. Most markets generally are in decline, especially the higher volume markets that drive demand out of the Midwest. But when you go into more rural markets like Bismarck, North Dakota, or even Hutchinson, Kansas, you're going to see slim increases with some volatility that drivers may be able to take advantage of leaving. But overall, the Midwest is still in decline. And like I called out before, the UAW strike is now at a tentative agreement, which could, in the coming weeks, bring some volume back, though I don't think it's going to have much of an impact overall in the Midwest.
I think any added volume will certainly be appreciated, but why don't we move on over to the Northeast?
It's a broken record. There's not much to talk about, just like the Jets and Giants game, which was extremely low scoring if you watched it with a bunch of punting. But jumping back to the freight markets, the higher volume markets such as Elizabeth, New Jersey, Allentown, Pennsylvania, and Harrisburg, Pennsylvania are still seeing decreases. Now, there are some remote markets and markets up in New England that are seeing some pressure, bringing some increases to the overall rates, leaving those markets. But overall, the Northeast is still trending downward, being led by the highest volume markets.
All right, Maze, what's going down in the coastal region?
This region continues to move favorable for shippers. And I called this out last week that we would likely see this happen. Now, one thing to keep an eye on is local and city freight, as we are seeing some pressure, especially in different parts of Virginia. But overall, the coastal region continues to be driving downward, especially on longer lengths of haul. Cross-country freight leaving the coastal region saw the largest decrease. And that's important to call out because the longer haul freight seeing a larger decrease, close to 2%, is a greater dollar amount than the city and local hauls. If you are picking up freight in the coastal region, getting some miles under you, you want to make sure you understand where you're going and where the best value you can end at, because you're not going to be paid top dollar leaving the coastal region, so make sure you get it on the return trip.
Great advice for carriers, Maze. Now, what's going on in the South?
We are seeing still a mixed story, just like I said, a broken record. Now, one call out is Oklahoma. The Oklahoma City market is softening after weeks of tightening. And Jenny, the Oklahoma Sooners football team followed suit this past weekend by being upset by Kansas, breaking their undefeated season. And we are seeing the same thing in the market in Oklahoma City. The freight market is on a downward trend, losing almost 2% of the gain that it experienced the last month. Now, overall in the South, we're seeing softening. But when you look at the San Antonio and Austin, Texas markets, there are some increases, but the volume driving markets such as Houston, Dallas, and Fort Worth are still favorable for shippers. And I don't see this changing in the coming weeks.
I have to agree with you there. And why don't we shift on over to the Southeast? What's happening? Any major call-outs, Maze?
Let's be honest, the weather was beautiful just about everywhere on the East Coast this weekend, feeling like Florida up in New York City, which is vastly different than what parts of the Midwest and West Coast experienced this past weekend with snowfall in places like Denver. But to get back to the freight markets in the Southeast, we are seeing a mixed story here. Now, Georgia is continuing to loosen, but parts of Florida are actually seeing increases. This isn't normal around this time of year, but also nothing to worry about. Jacksonville, Florida saw an increase just under 2%. And even Miami, Florida saw an increase over 1%. But again, I think this is just week over week changes. Overall, the Southeast continues to be soft. It's really the freight that's staying local. So freight picking up in Florida, delivering in Florida, that you're seeing those pressures result in higher rates. But overall, freight leaving the Southeast is going to continue to be heavily in favor of shippers.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about the West Coast. I know there's been a couple of different dynamic changes over the last couple of weeks. Where do we sit now?
Opposite to just about the entire East Coast and South, we are seeing tightening markets on the West Coast. Now, every market in the West region saw some type of gain. Most of it were very slim gains, but different markets that are more rural areas like Billings, Montana, saw greater gains. At the end of the day, the West Coast remained relatively flat, with two markets, San Diego and Seattle, Washington, actually experiencing declines.
Wait, did you say Seattle?
That's right, Jenny, Seattle, Washington, because the Pacific Northwest is actually starting to show some loosening as it starts shifting out of produce season a little bit early this year. Now, we got to keep an eye here because there are still more rural markets in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho that are seeing increases, but overall, we are starting to see the Pacific Northwest soften as carriers are not getting as high rates leaving there anymore. So in the coming weeks, you may start seeing that region up there flip with freight leaving there becoming much less desirable than it has been in the last month and a half. But again, we got to keep an eye here. The West Coast is definitely where carriers have a greater negotiating power than anywhere else they would be picking up freight throughout the country.
All right, Maze, I know that the resounding message of the last couple of episodes have really been that we shouldn't expect that volatile of a holiday season. But now that we are finally in November, can you give us any insights, specifically carriers, on what they can expect for the rest of the month?
Around Thanksgiving, carriers may be able to see some areas where they can push rates up, but it's not going to last long. Most of December, we're going to see markets drop back down like we have in the last 2 weeks. And then around the holidays, like Christmas and the New Year, of course, we're going to see that volatility traditionally seen going into the new year. But after that, to be honest, Jenny, it looks like it's going to continue to be a very tough market for the beginning of 2024.
And this is why partnerships are so important.
That's right, Jenny. That's why everyone, carrier and shipper alike, need to continue to be on top of what's happening in the market, not just rates and tender rejections, but what's happening with their carrier partners and broker partners as we continue to be in volatile times when it comes to operating a business and a prolonged depressed freight market.
I could not have said it better myself, Maze. With that, we will see you next week with an all-new episode of the Transfix Take podcast. And until then, please drive safely. All views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of Transfix Inc. or any parent companies or affiliates or the companies with which the participants are affiliated and may have been previously disseminated by them. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are based upon information considered reliable, but neither Transfix Inc. nor its affiliates nor the companies with which the participants are affiliated warrant its completeness or accuracy, and it should not be relied upon as such. All views and opinions are subject to change.